You know all those crooks, con men, and corrupt politicians that seem to absolutely dominate our news feeds today? Well, they aren't exactly modern inventions. In fact, they were perfectly mapped out over a century ago by 19th-century novelists. Today, we're diving into this explainer to see how classic literature actually offers us this piercing, almost uncanny gaze into today's society and the people who profit from it. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The archetypes of corruption. 2. The remorseless hack journalist. 3. Swindlers and universal banks. 4. The art of bot politics. 5. Blurring fiction and reality. And finally, number 6. The crime of the victim.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, the archetypes of corruption. It's time to meet the cast. Think of this as a lineup you could literally pull from this morning's headlines. These are the classic faces of corruption, and they've practically taken on a life of their own. We've got the professional journalist who justifies selling sleaze, the charming swindler building massive empires on false promises, the bot politician who treats votes like merchandise, the noble justifier who bends the rules for the greater good, and of course, the tragic victim who ends up taking the fall for trusting the system.
Moving right along to part 2, the remorseless hack journalist, selling the sleaze.
So authors like Guy de Maupassant and Henry James, they absolutely loved exploring this specific archetype. Take Henry James's character George Flack, for example. He's this remorseless hack working for a scandal sheet, and he relies on the oldest, most bulletproof justification for corruption out there. He claims he's simply giving the people what they want. It's the ultimate blank check for sleaze, right? He doesn't hesitate for a second to endanger a friend's love affair just to boost his paper's sales. And honestly, it rings incredibly true to the modern excuses we hear all the time. This idea that serving public demand somehow just magically forgives the collateral damage.
Okay, part 3, swindlers and universal banks. Let's look at the allure of the con.
Now, the swindler operates a lot like the journalist we just talked about, but on a way grander scale. We're talking massive financial promises and inevitable crushing bankruptcies. This brings us to a really brilliant realization from the character Madame Carline in Émile Zola's novel L'argent, or Money. She perfectly captures the dual nature of wealth during periods of huge industrial expansion. She basically falls into this awe-stricken admiration of money, realizing that the exact same passion for gambling that was rotting everything in Paris was simultaneously financing the workshops, the yards, and the buildings springing up out east.
So here's the crucial takeaway. While con men like Zola's protagonist, Saccard, were out there ruining lives with these fraudulent universal banks, that very same poisonous money was actually seen as the fertilizer required for building the physical world. It's a wild concept. Sigmund Freud actually chimed in on this mythology later on. He noted that society treats money with the exact same hypocrisy as sex. We constantly deny its true nature, which is, at its core, acquiring power over other people. Yet, as Zola pointed out, it was the necessary compost for executing great works.
Let's pivot to part 4, the art of bot politics, elections as marketplaces. Stepping into the political arena, both English and Russian literature depicted the search for political consensus as a literal cash-and-carry market. In his satire The Pickwick Papers, Charles Dickens breaks down the remarkably cynical but effective steps to winning a 19th-century election. Step 1. Parade the streets handing out remarkably cheap alcohol. Step 2. Get the voters dizzy and drunk to secure their blind loyalty. And Step 3. Well, for the few calculating holdouts who are still sober, you just pay them cash right before the polls close.
Both Dickens and Anthony Trollope recognized clearly that voters were simply being bought for cold, hard cash, essentially turning Parliament into what the poet William Morris bluntly called a dung market. And get this, Trollope actually experienced this firsthand. After writing all these novels about ambitious young men easily winning over ignorant districts, Trollope ran for Parliament himself. And he lost. He lost to a conservative opponent who was far more versed in giving the voters exactly what they wanted. Cash on the nail. As the philosopher Thomas Carlyle noted, in some eras, payment in cash is quite literally the only relationship between individuals.
Which brings us to part 5, blurring fiction and reality, the moral dilemma.
Let's zoom out from fiction for a second and look at historical reality, because separating vice from virtue isn't just some literary parlor game. We see a massive moral dilemma with American President Abraham Lincoln. When he was struggling to pass the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, Lincoln was short 2 votes. He explicitly instructed his allies, and I quote, "Those 2 votes must be procured. I leave it to you to determine how it shall be done. But remember that I am President of the United States clothed with immense power."
He used corrupt instructions because he viewed the ultimate success as an absolute moral duty.
I really want you to chew on this for a second. Does a moral end justify corrupt means? Even historical heavyweights like Cavour, a key figure in unifying Italy, admitted something incredibly similar. He flat out said that if he had committed, for purposes of personal self-interest, even a tiny fraction of what he had done to unify Italy, he would rightly be considered among the worst evildoers imaginable. It completely challenges our entire framework of ethics when we realize the greatest historical achievements are sometimes built on the exact same mechanisms as the lowest street cons.
And finally, Part 6, The Crime of the Victim, a cynical finale. We're going to wrap up this explainer with a story I know you're all familiar with, but we're going to look at it through a devastatingly cynical lens that perfectly captures the 19th-century view of systemic corruption. I'm talking about Carlo Collodi's 1883 tale of Pinocchio. We all know the setup, right? Pinocchio is convinced by the cat and the fox to invest his few coins in the field of miracles, expecting a money tree to just sprout up. It's basically a classic Ponzi scheme, trusting blind faith over common sense. The villains naturally dig up the coins and run away. So Pinocchio, who still believes in the justice system, goes straight to the local judge to report the crime.
But here comes the shocking twist that really plays with our moral compass. The judge punishes the victim instead of the criminals. Upon hearing the whole tale, the judge doesn't launch some grand investigation into the cat and the fox. No, instead, he issues a swift decree. This poor simpleton has been robbed of 4 gold pieces. Take him, therefore, and throw him into prison.
Collodi is revealing a justice system that is just deeply, deeply compromised. In a world run by those who exploit the rules, the hack journalists, the swindlers, the bought politicians, the institutions simply bend to protect the predators and punish the naive.
I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder today. When you look at the archetypes of corruption all around us, the media spin, the financial collapses, the political gridlock fueled by money, is the system broken or is it working exactly as it was designed? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating intersection of literature and history with me.